Center of it all stands a man whose smile has become as recognizable as any Hollywood celebrity. Joel Osteen. His church brings in approximately $100 million annually, making it one of the wealthiest religious institutions in America. And here's where things get interesting. Almost none of that money goes to Joel Osteen himself. Wait, what? See, this is where the story everyone thinks they know takes a sharp turn into territory that might surprise you. The narrative you've probably heard goes something like this. Televangelist builds empire, collects millions from desperate followers, lives in a mansion while preaching prosperity. But when you actually follow the money trail through Lakewood Church's financial documents, bank records, and tax filings, a much stranger picture emerges. One that reveals as much about how we think about religion and money in America as it does about one very unusual pastor. Let me tell you about a morning in 2017 that changed everything about how people viewed Joel Osteen. Hurricane Harvey had just devastated Houston. Water was rising. Families were trapped on rooftops. People were drowning in their cars, and Lakewood Church, that massive 16,000-seat facility, sat closed. The social media backlash was instantaneous and brutal. Osteen was trending worldwide and not in a good way. Critics pointed to his wealth, his mansion, his apparent indifference. The megachurch pastor who preached about abundance seemed to have forgotten about charity when his city needed it most. Except here's what actually happened. And this is where we need to start separating fact from fiction. The church's initial statement claimed the building was inaccessible due to flooding. This wasn't entirely accurate. Photos showed the church was largely dry, though the surrounding areas were indeed flooded. But within days, after intense public pressure, Lakewood opened its doors and became a distribution center, housing and feeding hundreds of people. The church ultimately distributed millions of dollars in aid. But the damage to Osteen's reputation was done, and it revealed something crucial. People were ready, even eager to believe the worst about him. The question is, why? Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig deeper than the headlines to find the stories that actually matter. To understand how Joel Osteen actually spends church donations, we need to understand something fundamental about his financial setup, something that might genuinely shock you. Since 2005, Joel Osteen has not taken a single dollar in salary from Lakewood Church. Not one penny. Zero. This isn't a secret, though it's rarely mentioned in the critical articles. It's documented in the church's financial disclosures. So if the church brings in $100 million a year and the pastor doesn't take a salary, where does the money go? And more importantly, where does Joel Osteen's considerable personal wealth come from? The plot thickens. Joel Osteen is worth an estimated $50 to $100 million. His mansion in River Oaks, one of Houston's most exclusive neighborhoods, is valued at approximately $10.5 million. It's a 17,000 square foot estate with 6 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 3 elevators, and a guest house. He drives luxury cars. He wears expensive suits. By any measure, the man is wealthy. But here's the twist that makes this story fascinating. That wealth doesn't come from your grandmother's tithes or from desperate people buying miracle water or blessed prayer cloths. It comes from book sales. In 2004, Osteen published Your Best Life Now, 7 Steps to Living at Your Full Potential. It became a phenomenon, spending more than 200 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Over 10 million copies sold. Foreign rights, speaking tours, more books followed. Become a Better You sold 5 million copies. I Declare was another massive hit. His publishing deal was reportedly worth $13 million for just one book. These are commercial publishing deals, not church-funded projects. The money goes directly to Osteen, not through the church. Warner Faith and Simon & Schuster aren't funneling money into Lakewood's coffers. They're paying Joel Osteen personally as an author. This creates a strange dynamic that even critics have struggled to attack effectively. Osteen became wealthy the most American way possible. He wrote books that millions of people wanted to buy. No one was forced to purchase them. The money didn't come from tax-deductible church donations. It came from commercial transactions in bookstores and on Amazon. He's essentially a self-help author who happens to be a pastor, rather than a pastor who's getting rich off his congregation. But this still leaves the massive question. What happens to that $100 million that flows into Lakewood Church every year? The church operates with a staff of approximately 368 employees. The building itself, the former Compact Center, required $105 million in renovations when the church purchased it. That was paid through fundraising, not from regular tithes. The monthly operational costs are staggering. You're lighting, heating, and cooling a space designed for NBA games. The television broadcast reaches over 100 countries. Production isn't cheap. Those cameras, that lighting, the satellite time, the broadcast team, the editing, the distribution, it's essentially a television studio operation that happens to be a church. Here's where it gets interesting for anyone who's ever wondered about megachurch finances. Lakewood Church spends approximately $30 million annually just on facility operations and media production. Another significant chunk goes to staff salaries. The church employs everyone from pastors and counselors to maintenance workers and media technicians. Unlike Austin, these people do draw salaries from the church. Then there are the ministries. Lakewood runs prison ministries, addiction recovery programs, and international outreach efforts. They operate a food distribution program that serves thousands of Houston families monthly. But here's where the story gets complicated, and this is the "it's not what you think" moment that might frustrate both Austin's defenders and critics. Lakewood Church is not required to publicly disclose its complete financial records, and it doesn't. As a religious organization under IRS Code 501c3, churches have a special exemption. They don't have to file Form 990, the detailed financial disclosure that other nonprofits must submit. This means that while we know some spending categories from what the church voluntarily discloses and from investigative reporting, the complete picture remains opaque. We don't know exactly how much goes to international missions versus administrative costs. We don't know the salaries of top administrators. We don't know the breakdown of media spending versus direct charitable work. This lack of transparency is where the real controversy should be, but it's rarely what people focus on. Instead, the conversation centers on Austin's personal wealth, which ironically is the one aspect that's actually above board and documented. I want to pause here and ask you something. Where are you watching this from, and what do you think about religious organizations not being required to disclose their finances? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective, especially if you're part of a religious community. What's your profession? Does your workplace have more financial transparency than churches do? Let's talk about it. Now, let me tell you about the scandal that nobody talks about. In 2014, a plumber working at Lakewood Church discovered something extraordinary. Behind a loose toilet in a church bathroom wall, he found envelopes. Lots of envelopes, filled with cash and checks.
We talk a lot about Jesus on this podcast. Unsurprising, really. But what about his mother, Mary? She not only raised Jesus, but was a founding member of the early Christian movement. Today, I'm joined by Dr. James Tabor to talk about the woman behind the Messiah, what her life was like, and how she influenced the formation of Christianity. Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. Hello again. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure you knew about the specials we're running this December on all of our Christmas-themed courses. Highlights include a brand new course with Dr. Jody Magnus, Herod, the Tyrant of Christmas, plus a new face-to-face on the Bible discussion asking, was Jesus really born in Bethlehem? A lively conversation between Bart and Catholic apologist Jimmy Akin. We're also offering up to 60% off our Christmas courses with a limited time Christmas bundle. Head over to barterman.com/courses for all the holiday deals, good for December only. And as always, use the code MJPodcast at checkout for a special discount. Hello, everybody. And welcome back to the Misquoting Jesus podcast. Today I am interviewing Dr. James Tabor about the historic Mary. Dr. Tabor retired in 2022 as a full-time professor from the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he taught Christian origins and ancient Judaism for 33 years, serving as chair for a decade. He is currently a distinguished fellow in the Faculty of Humanities at the Hebrew University at Jerusalem. His most recent book, The Lost Mary, Rediscovering the Mother of Jesus, published in September 2025, and attempts to uncover the historical Mary, a founding member of the early Christian movement who has been systematically erased over the past 2,000 years. He's joining me today to talk about Mary apart from Jesus, the world she lived in, and the woman she was. James, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here. There's something about Mary, as we say, right?
There really is, isn't there? And you and I have talked about this before, but I'm looking forward to kind of getting a slightly different angle on the conversation.
Yeah.
So to dive in, what do we know about Mary's family and what her life would have been like prior to kind of where the Bible picks up, where the New Testament picks up with her move to Nazareth?
Yeah, the book, I'm going to hold it up, The Lost Mary, builds on that because and I love this picture, so I always want to show it, because here we're looking at an image of a kind of Mona Lisa expression, and maybe she's thinking about the very things that we're talking about here. I like to wonder about that. But anyway, it's a patchwork that you have to put together, and sometimes it seems to hang on threads. I'll give you an example, not of Mary, but just to illustrate what I mean. Everybody knows Jesus was a carpenter, right? I mean, who doesn't know that? I've seen it on license plates even, or little things on the back of cars. My boss is a Jewish carpenter. First time I saw that, I thought that was pretty, nifty. But that hangs on one verse in Mark. Is this not the carpenter? And even though the word we think means something like builder, the point is a single thread, one verse, can just sweep the world, and every single Christian has heard, oh yeah, he was a carpenter, even if they don't know exactly what the word means. So in the same way with Mary, they're bits and pieces that we have to put together. And a lot of things we don't know. I point out in the book, there are only about a dozen passages in the New Testament on Mary. So the first question people ask me is, well, how did you write a book on Mary? And it's a combination of what we could get from our gospel accounts, but then we need to read them critically, as we always try to do. And it doesn't mean you just, open your New Testament, whatever is there, you've got Mary. Because we try first to date her. And many of us have pretty well settled on the death of Herod the Great as 4 BC. So that becomes a kind of an anchor. I just want to go through this one point as to how we build a case from, you might say, a thread or a breadcrumb or whatever analogy you want to use. So we got Herod the Great. Now we know a lot about him. So all the time that Mary's growing up, if she has a child at maybe age 14, that is Jesus, then we can go, and Herod is now dying, we can go back into the latter years of his reign, so that as she is growing up, she's hearing about this ruler, Herod the Great, who's declared king of the Jews much earlier by the emperor himself, Octavian, who at the time, he's not emperor, but he becomes the Emperor Augustus. So that's very important. And I've often made the point that, in my own life, I was born just after World War II. So I'm dating myself here. I'm older. But when I grew up, even though I hadn't experienced any of the war because I wasn't born, throughout the 50s, any child born into the 50s and 60s, the baby boomers, as I was, World War II is just this huge thing that we remember and talk about, and people are dead and back and wounded, and it's just hard to believe. Vietnam was bad and Iraq was bad, but nothing compared to World War II in terms of what it did to the country. Well, that happened in Mary's life. Also, geography. So world ruler, Herod dies, She's maybe 14 to 16. That seems to be the average age for women getting married. So let's just say 14. So she's hearing all the time about this tyrant and what he does. And news would travel, let me tell you, in that country. But then geographically, she's living just south of the major urban center of the entire Galilee. It's a town called Sepphoris. I have a chapter in the book about this lost city of Sepphoris. It's not really lost. It's just when I graduated from University of Chicago with the PhD, I'm glad I didn't interview with you. You weren't born then, probably, but why? Because you might have said, "Well, tell me about Sepphoris." I didn't know anything about Sepphoris. I studied texts, and I was very familiar with Christian origins, the same way that our friend Bart Ehrman was trained. We had very similar training, and Sepphoris just wasn't on our radar. Since then, I've excavated there. I've been there many, many times. I take groups there. I talk about it. And suddenly you have this urban backdrop with Mary in Nazareth. And as you fill in more things that happened around that time, and I try to recreate that in the book, where you get the feel for it. You might not remember all the names and dates, but you will come away thinking, wow, anyone who lived through this at that spot in the Galilee, because when Herod dies, a revolt breaks out. So not only is she hearing about all the things that Herod did the last 5 years of his life, like murder sons and riot and kill other rivals and so forth, and all the political moves with Rome, but also there are these revolts that break out, and one of the major ones is in the north at Sepphoris, 4 miles from where Mary lived. The city was burned. Jesus would have been, if he was born in 5 BC, about a year before Herod was born. We're not exactly sure the date, but these are like pegs that we can kind of imagine. So we are imagining, but we're imagining, I'd like to say, in the direction of the truth, because we have these historical realities going on. So if she's a real person in a real place at a real time, what's there to say about that? And it's almost never talked about. Everyone wants to go to Bethlehem. And, we know so little about that. And many scholars even wonder how historical it is. But I'll tell you what is historical, that she grew up in Nazareth outside of Sepphoris, and all of these events are happening. So you have to begin there, I think, with the history of the times and the backdrop and how it would have affected her. And the vivid image that I have, it's a chapter in the book called 2000 Crucifixions, is when that revolt does break out. And now Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, has taken rule of the Galilee. He wants to be as great as his father, but he only rules the northern territory. But his palace and the reconstruction of the city is during Mary's time as she's holding the infant Jesus. So you have this poignant image of Mary nursing Jesus. Maybe he's about a year old, and the city is going up in flames just over the hill. I mean, it would just be chilling. So that's the kind of thing that you can begin to reconstruct. Now, from that, I would add something else. Let's go back to Sepphoris for a moment. In Sepphoris, on the south side, it's on a hill. I have pictures and images in the book. A city set on a hill cannot be hid is one of Jesus's phrases, and he probably is talking about Sepphoris. It's on the top of a hill, and you can see it for miles around in a flat valley. And so one of the things that you notice if you look at the archaeology of Sepphoris, where I've excavated, is on the south side, there are the ruins of the house of Mary. Now, millions of tourists go to Nazareth, and they see there a house of Mary. How many houses of Mary are there? But we do have a later Byzantine text, as well as the ruins of a first century house and a Byzantine church from the fourth century built over this house, and this house is in Sepphoris. And then as we begin to pull in other little threads and breadcrumbs and tidbits of how we might fill in the picture, because we've already got her in an urban setting in a very dramatic time, it could well be that she grew up in Sepphoris. I haven't heard that discussed much, I guess because it's hanging on, Byzantine archaeology, and maybe it's not that accurate historically. But those kinds of things that were set up for the Christian pilgrims in the first century, I think they might have some validity. And later, a Crusader church is built over it. And the ruins of that are still there today. I have a photo in the book. And I've roamed those ruins. I've sat on some of those Crusader stones, and I know they're Crusader, but down below, I know there are the ruins of this first century house on the south side of Sepphoris. So that fuels your imagination. Not only could she from Nazareth, as a young mother nursing Jesus, see the destruction of the city and then watch the rebuilding, because Herod Antipas rebuilt it, as I said, but also growing up. Now, we like some parents, right? And where are we going to get parents? Well, it's actually from a text that's from the 2nd century, so it's not in the New Testament. We don't get this kind of thing in the New Testament. But we do get a name of a couple, Joachim and Anna. Anna would be Hannah in Hebrew, and Joachim is the name of one of the ancient kings of Israel from the tribe of Judah. So these names, particularly Joachim, sounds like a sort of a royal name. And in this text, it's called the Proto-Evangelium of James. Now, it's just full of crazy legends. I don't think we can rely on it much for any of its stories or tales. It's mainly defending the virginity of Mary and the perpetual virginity. Even when Jesus is born, she stays as if she's never had a child, without going into details there. And so it's not explained how that happens, but she is still a virgin, and the childbirth did not in any way affect her body. So that's the kind of text it is. But if we have the ruins in Sepphoris, we have Joachim and Anna living there, and they're quite wealthy. They're not poverty-stricken peasants living in a little village way out of the way from the urban center. They're in the urban center. That does fit the story. And one of the things we do as critical scholars is we ask, why would you add something that would be embarrassing to the later view of Mary if it's not the case? So let's say in the 2nd century, I'm going to tell you about Joachim and Anna, the parents of Mary, and how she grew up, and that he's a wealthy landowner, and they're living in the north there by Sepphoris. And why would I say that he's wealthy if all the later views of Mary is a villager, poverty-stricken, barely able to read or write or do anything, and yet you tell the story in an opposite way? So can we prove that? Absolutely not. There's so little that we could prove, but we can begin to assemble a picture. So that's the method. And there are many cases where I do that throughout the book and throughout my study. So archaeology, texts in the New Testament, texts outside the New Testament, not harmonizing them, but finding out if there's a kind of a convergence. And you find stray things where, well, yeah, that does fit then, you see. And the other thing I just want to add is she flees in haste when her pregnancy is discovered to the hill country of Judea. This is according to Luke's account. He's the only one who has this. Mark never even discusses Mary, right? There's no birth or anything. And John is just, Jesus is the Word made flesh. He's way beyond birth. Obviously, his mother's referred to. By the way, she's never named in the Gospel of John. Talk about not being too concerned about the human. Let's don't even name her. Just his mother, his mother, his mother, his mother. Like, okay, he's the main guy. He's the Word of God. He's the Logos. He became, the divine incarnation of the Word that in the beginning is with God. So back to Luke. And why is she fleeing to Judea? Well, she has a relative. Is it a cousin, an aunt? We're not sure. The word in Greek just means a close relative. And her name is Elizabeth, and she's the mother of John the Baptist. So is this myth making? Is this just trying to connect Jesus and John the Baptist? In some ways, you don't want to do that later when you write the New Testament. Why? Because they're early layers where John could even be seen as the teacher of Jesus. Jesus submits to his baptism, and Jesus, according to some of our records, baptizes himself, and there's less protest. Like in Mark, there's no protest at all by Jesus. We go, oh no, I can't baptize you. John says that in Matthew. You're so great. You should baptize me. None of that. So in our earliest text, Mark, he just goes down to be baptized by John. It sounds very straightforward. John's preaching, and all the righteous people should respond to repent and be part of that. So there's this aversion to making Jesus too connected to John in, say, Mark, because John has got to sort of decrease, and especially in Matthew, and then finally in Luke, it even gets more. Did you know Luke, it's hard to keep all these straight, and I know you do a lot of interviewing, but Luke doesn't even have a baptismal scene. Isn't that interesting? He just says, when Jesus was baptized and he was praying. Oh, okay. But that's totally different than going down to the water and description of being in the water and being baptized. And John doesn't mention it at all. He just says, oh, the one I saw the Holy Spirit come upon, that's the guy. So we try to kind of pull back some of these layers. And when we do that, we find out that Mary has a relative in Judea, and she stays there until the baby John is born, because Elizabeth is pregnant with John, the baptizer. So they're related. That gives you another thread to kind of connect her maybe to Judea. And there is some archaeology there that I've done, happen to be involved in. There's a cave outside of Jerusalem that we call the Cave of John the Baptist, and it has first century materials in it, ceramics and so forth, and quite a lot, like up to 1 meter of material. So it was being used in that time, and it's the largest water system in the hill country of Judea. And Mary, Elizabeth, the mother of John, lives in Ein Kerem, which is literally less than a quarter mile from this huge reservoir. So that even connects in some possible ways. So we've got archaeology at Sepphoris, we've got archaeology in the hill country of Judea.
There are a lot of strange historical bits and pieces tangled up in the festival of Christmas. In some ways, it's like looking at a painting that's had
Gia is a tremendously insightful individual, very compelling, very persuasive. The main thing that I think he got wrong is I think he was sort of taking some statements that I made and saying, as refutations, these statements don't work. And the fact that these statements don't work as refutations of the minimal witnesses argument means that you don't understand the argument. Do I believe in a bodily resurrection, that Jesus actually came to Peter and appeared to Peter in full physical form? I don't think
50%, right?
It's probably less than 50% reasonable.
Less than 50, okay.
Yeah. For instance, let's say I resurrected from the dead tomorrow and I appeared to 100 people, right? Well, I would still say it doesn't really matter. It's just a footnote in history unless I leave behind a teaching that's irrelevant.
It doesn't matter if the teachings that you leave behind are good or bad. If we have good material evidence that you were resurrected, then you were resurrected. I don't think that even if I granted that Jesus is the most impactful philosopher in the world, in the history, that means he's divine. How do we know that mere human beings, mere mortal, cannot come up with those profound moral principles or teachings? We can see some of those really profound teachings right in the Gospels, which we know are attributed to Jesus, but are not authentic.
Well, I think one simple way that we can know is look at the degree of sophistication of the teachings of Jesus and compare that to the degree of sophistication of the writing of the Gospels themselves.
Davos and Abri, thanks for agreeing to this conversation. You have been getting a lot more attention lately, especially after Paulogia released a video responding to your criticism of his minimal witness hypothesis. In a recent comment, you laid out your own uncertainty pretty clearly. You said something like this: is there a God? 53% yes. If there is a God, did Jesus have some divine authority? 60% yes. Was there a bodily resurrection? 50%. With that level of tentativeness on the big questions, I want to start here. Why spend so much time and energy critiquing Paulogia's minimal witness hypothesis? What do you see as the main stakes of that debate? And what outcome are you hoping for, either for your own thinking or for your audience?
Yeah, so first of all, excellent question. Second of all, thanks very much for having me on. You have a really great channel. I won't, we had a lot of pleasantries before the video started, but I did want to say again, your channel is absolutely fantastic. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about my degree of uncertainty. Now, this was kind of a cheeky comment that I posted, so I hope no one will take this too literally. Obviously, these are, you can't give you a percentage of certainty, but I think my point in that particular comment was to underscore that my main argument is, if you have a theistic belief or a belief that there is a theology in the world that is extant, that still exists, that is more correct, I think it's a fairly easy argument to be made that that theology ought to be based on Jesus. Now, I have a few specific reasons for that, but again, that's kind of what I was reflecting in the comment. Now, am I certain about some of the things that I think about? Is there a God? Is Jesus that, did he have some sort of divine authority or some sort of divine message or divine mandate from God? That's another question. On both those questions, I think I'm fairly uncertain. As most people who have been part of my channel for a while know, I'm generally speaking, a lifelong atheist. And so I still allow for quite a bit of latitude in terms of the degree of uncertainty that I have. Now, in terms of the other question that you had is, what is my goal for making these arguments if my degree of certainty isn't that high? I think, so I've been engaging with these arguments for quite a few years, mostly from the atheistic side of these arguments. And I recently sort of decided that I think a lot of arguments that are at least have a proclivity towards inclining that there's probably a God in the universe and that Jesus is probably had some sort of divine authority. That's a relatively new conclusion for me, but I feel like the analysis that points in that direction is underrepresented. In other words, if you look at Christian apologetical voices that are commonly sometimes overrepresented in the lay public debate, I think a lot of those voices are sort of making similar arguments that it's good to believe in Jesus for reasons that are inherently theological. And I think for many people who are like me, who are sort of in that gray zone of not being super certain about these questions, some of the arguments that I'm putting out there seem like they're underrepresented in the general lay public debate. So my goal is to highlight those arguments more. The other reason why I wanted to put these arguments out there is because I think that as somebody who was an atheist for many, many years, I kind of absorbed this party line of atheism, which is that the evidence for any religion, particularly Christianity, is very flimsy, and so that was kind of what I believed for a long time. So it was a bit of a switch for me to say, I'm not as certain about that anymore. And now I definitely think that the evidence is not as flimsy. And then the third reason why I wanted to put out these arguments is really for my own intellectual, theological, spiritual, if you want to say, personal growth. In other words, I'm hopeful that there is an audience for a bit more of a lukewarm theological perspective and some of my takes, which are, I think, spicy, but sort of a little bit more guided by uncertainty. I hope there's an audience for that. But if the only person who gets something out of these debates is myself, then I'm still okay with that. In other words, if I learn a lot theologically, that's fine. If I come out of a lot of these debating experiences and a lot of these conflictual scenarios in terms of like the Hegelian dialectical model of conflict, and I come out with a more atheistic perspective, I'm totally okay with that as long as I've learned from the experience.
So is it true that the reason why you are engaging in these debates is more about joining the conversation, and because you think you have something to offer, and so you put it on the table and you want to see what reactions you get? Maybe other people can learn from your input, and maybe you can learn from other people's reaction. So what's on the stake is not necessarily whether you want to believe or not to believe, but to kind of expand the knowledge base and more like an education, for a purpose of education. Does that sound right?
That's pretty close. I would say just, a slight refinement of that is, do I believe that my perspective belongs in the debate? Not necessarily. Do I believe that the arguments that I've specifically made belong in the debate? I think those arguments are underrepresented. I think they do belong in the debate. It's not that I have so much to offer personally. It's really that I think the arguments are valid and are underrepresented.
Okay. So I mentioned about Pelagia's response video. So after reviewing Pelagia's response video to your critique, what strikes you as the strongest point and the weakest point in his minimal witness hypothesis as you understand it now?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. All right, so what is the strongest point that he makes? And I'm just a little bit. We're going to talk about minimal witnesses, and I'd love to talk about some other things. And the reason is just because I've had a lot of content on the minimal witnesses argument and the pros and cons of it. So first of all, I'd be remiss if I didn't say Paulo Gia is a tremendously insightful individual, very compelling, very persuasive. I thought his critique of some of the things that I said was very much on point. The main thing that I think he got wrong is I think he was sort of taking some statements that I made and saying, as refutations, these statements don't work. And the fact that these statements don't work as refutations of the minimal witnesses argument means that you don't understand the argument. Instead, I think a better sort of characterization is that what I was offering initially was a critique. I was very specific on that point. I said, these are not refutations, they're critiques. And I think that now those are sort of I think that's maybe the strongest point that Paulo Gia said during his video about me was maybe some of his analysis about post-bereavement hallucinations. I think for me that did move the needle slightly. I still think that he has probably switched his opinion based on some of the other videos that he's released and some of the other things that he said since he put out his initial video. His initial video said 30% of people who are bereaved will have experiences where they see, hear, and talk to the decedent, right, the person who's passed away. Now, that's almost exactly a direct quote from him. So when I think he's probably backed off on that. I think the literature supports that that's not an accurate claim, that if you go with a number as high as 30%, you're probably including not only post-bereavement sensory hallucinations, but maybe quasi-sensory experiences. And the literature seems to acknowledge that there is this bifurcation. They're not all hallucinations when we talk about post-bereavement hallucinations. They're not all what we think of in that category specifically as a true sensory hallucination. Some of the experiences that people have are quasi-sensory experiences. In other words, just sort of a sense that the loved one, the deceased person, is still there. So I think we've probably both moved a little bit in that regard. I think I had a pretty strong point to make about the 48.24.1 Ulpian's Digesta, which is a dissertation on what Roman laws were in regards to crucifixion victims. I think Paulo Gia is probably wrong in how he cites that law, but I think based on some of the statements that he's made, he would sort of agree to that. And he would agree that that's not something that's, and he sort of like pushed that out of minimal witnesses, even though it was an important point of his initial argumentations around minimal witnesses. So I think there's some ways that he's sort of moved in a direction. There are some ways that I've sort of moved in a direction. Like I said, his critique that I was cherry picking in my literary analysis of the scholarly literature around post-bereavement hallucinations, I think that was a valid critique. But and then the rest of the things that I would say about Paulo Gia's argument are probably like a little bit more in the realm of fairly minor quibbles. But I will say this, I don't think Paulo Gia was correct that I didn't understand the argument. I think I understood the argument. There are certainly some things that I could have explained a little better, but there are some things that I said that were more critiques than refutations. And that may have led to some confusion.
I was reading this article earlier today, and I was kind of wondering, when you are talking about sensory and quasi-sensory experiences, it seems that when psychologists are writing these kind of papers, post-bereavement hallucinations, they would include not just what we would typically think of as hallucination, but also other more broader sensations. So for example, post-bereavement hallucinations of the deceased are most frequently a felt presence We normally wouldn't think of felt presence to be like a sensory, but it says 39% to 52%. Then followed by auditory, 13 to 30, and visual, 14 to 26 experiences. So what I was getting at is that when atheists or people or skeptics talk about post-bereavement hallucinations and they quote like numbers as high as 30% or 40%, maybe they were quoting from papers that not only talk about auditory, visual, or tactile, but they also talk about just like a strong feeling of the deceased person's presence. And that would also be included in the percentage. So maybe that's why we intuitively think that the number is just too high. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think the other thing that Apology uses a source, which is Camp et al. In 2020, which is a really great article, and it's also a systematic review, so it reviews other articles and kind of pulls them in. I think the point that that article makes most persuasively is that these other sources, which are a little bit older, like a 1970s source, a 1990s source, probably use very different definitions of what is an actual post-bereavement hallucination. So some of the definitional lack of clarity is why these categories have shifted over time, and why some of these percentages have shifted over time, and why they have very broad ranges in some of these percentages. So I will say this: I think Apology's argument, minimal witnesses, can work if you have a quasi-sensory experience and not a true sensory hallucination. But I think it's a bigger uphill battle. In other words, is it possible that Peter didn't have an actual sensory experience, that he just sort of felt the presence of Jesus, and therefore he concluded that Jesus had risen from the dead? Yes, I think that's a possibility. But I think it's a much less convincing argument. I think if you start from the perspective that Peter had an actual hallucination, it sounds much more persuasive. So I won't go into like that here, but there's a lot of reasons why we think that Peter's experience, if it was indeed a hallucination, which I don't personally think it was probably very atypical for what we know about post-bereavement hallucinations. Now, the other important tidbit is that in the DSM-5, the category of persistent grief disorder, PGD, was added only as a new entity in 2022. That's my understanding. And so some of those definitions have been clarified since this older literature, like Rees from the 70s, Grimby from the 90s, some of that older literature is probably not as relevant. And what we need is a study that moves forward in a way that's not as retrospective, that's not as survey-based, that's not as biased, that really kind of goes into the realm of what post-bereavement hallucinations are, with a more clinically precise definition of what they are and what they aren't. And really the bigger question is, in the psychiatry literature, is what does that mean? In other words, does it mean something bad if somebody's having a post-bereavement hallucination? Does it mean that they'll have a higher risk of moving on to have prolonged grief disorder? We do know that some post-bereavement hallucinations, and again, I'm using the term hallucinations very broadly, are very positive and help people move on from the bereavement episode, and some are very negative and help sort of entrench people in their sense of bereavement. So that's probably enough on that for now. But there's great literature coming out. I suspect these definitions will be clarified and expanded on in future years, and we may even have a little bit more clarity in future years about whether or not the disciples had an experience that can be likened to post-bereavement hallucinations. I will say this: I think the literature is quite clear that right now it's too early to say that we have a good explanation for the disciples' experiences with the resurrected Jesus. And I say disciples broadly. I think we're talking about just Peter if we're talking about the minimal witnesses model, at least initially. It may be that we will have more clarity on that question in the future. I think right now the answer is we don't have a great explanation for what Peter experienced. If it is grief-based hallucinations, then I think the literature making that connection is, at least right now, very murky and very tenuous.
So you were saying that you don't think that Peter saw a hallucination. So how would you account for the emergence of the belief that Jesus was from the dead? Do you think that it actually happened? Or do you think there are other better naturalistic explanations to explain the emergence of that belief?
Yeah, that's a good question. So do I believe in a bodily resurrection, that Jesus actually came to Peter and appeared to Peter in full physical form? I think that's, I go back and forth on that a little bit. I don't think
50%, right?
It's probably less than 50% reasonably.
Less than 50, okay.
Yeah. It could be some sort of a visionary or visual experience. I don't know. It's not a huge part of my theology. The most important part of my initial video response to Apologia was actually at the end of the video, where I actually talk about a specific thought experiment And, I've made this point in several other videos, that is the question whether or not a miracle actually occurred, or is a question more about what is the theological impactfulness about a chain of events or a mechanistic explanation. In other words, usually the debate between apologetics and atheists is, did God cause this, or can we explain this in with a naturalistic explanation? Now, the reason why I think that debate is not intellectually nourishing is as follows. There's always a potentially naturalistic explanation for almost every miracle event that we find in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, which I understand that's an offensive term, so I'm trying to switch to the Tanakh as a term for the Old Testament. So let's just think of an example of the splitting of the Red Sea, right? We can explain that through naturalistic events. So do we say it's not a miracle because we can explain it? Or do we say, well, that still falls under the category of providence? And the reason why it falls under that category is because it just happened. It's an unusual situation that happened in the right place, in the right time, just in the way that would have been necessary for a specific outcome to have been propagated from that experience. Let me put the question to you in another way, because we've had this debate in the comment section. Is there, if you and I are on a desert island, right, and we decide that there is a God, right, and we have some basic conclusions about God, would we ever expect God to intervene in the world in a way that is discernibly supernatural, in a way that circumvents the laws of nature? I think the argument is we would never reach that conclusion because it would be illogical. The reason why it would be illogical is we're specifically saying that God is the architect of the laws of nature, right? So why would God ever need to circumvent those laws? If you're omniscient and omnipotent and omnitemporal, which most people would say that's probably a couple of good definitions for the omni categories of God, then you would never need to circumvent the laws that you yourself have made for the universe. It's not a logical point. In other words, if we scratch the surface hard enough for long enough, we should be able to find a naturalistic explanation for everything that happens in the history of human experience.
That's interesting take, because when we think about the critical scholars, when they put forward some explanation for the splitting of Red Sea, such as the wind blows and the water, etc., it could be all naturalistic and it requires no miracle. But when it comes to a resurrection after 3 days in room temperature, I don't think that's naturalistically possible, because when a person dies, the decay is immediately starts to happen. And after 3 days, there is really no known natural cause that can reverse that process and brings the person back to life. So in effect, that would require a suspension or a bending of the laws of nature as we know. So it's kind of different from a wind blowing on the Red Sea at the right time, at the right place, versus a dead body needing to come back to life after 3 days of death. I think they are still different. What do you think about that?
Excellent point. And that was exactly the point that I made in my response to Apologia initially. This was in a part of the video that he didn't address at all. But my question is, so here was the thought experiment that I posed at the end of my initial video to Apologia. If you believe that the minimal witnesses model happened, then I think you have to at least accept the proposition that it's an extremely unlikely sequence of events, right? Now, if we have a very unlikely sequence of events, how much is that at all kind of going towards the direction where we're calling it a miracle? In other words, is a miracle by definition something that we know is impossible, that has a 0% chance of occurring? Or is it something that just, we have a mechanism for it, we have an explanation, but it just seems to happen in the right way, at the right time, at just the right place to make it indistinguishable from the action of providence? So let me give you a different thought experiment. And I hope that this is a more direct answer to your question. Let's say that we exhume the body of Paul, right? And we exhume the body of Peter, okay? And let's say that they both have this interesting finding where we look at their cranial bones, right? And we find that they both have tumors, like a rare tumor in their middle cranial fossa that cause them to have hallucinations and cause them to have visionary experiences, right? We could say, well, that should point us in the direction of atheism because now we have a better explanation, right? I would actually make the case that makes both of those individuals more susceptible to a visual or visionary experience. And that to me suggests that there's something very unlikely that lined up in a very, very precise and very, very unusual way to result in an apparent resurrection. Now, I like using the phraseology of apparent resurrection because it kind of nails down what I do believe in. I believe that there was an apparent resurrection. I believe there was like sort of an early proclamation of events. Now, we can go into that a little later. And I don't want to spend all the time on the minimal witnesses argument, but I do want to get on to other things. But I think that's kind of the point that I make in my video response to Apologia. If we think that Apologia has touched upon something that is infinitesimally probable, that is almost exceedingly uncommon to the point that it only happened once in human history potentially, doesn't that seem a lot like providence? So in other words, I could see somebody believing in something like the minimal witnesses model and still saying, well, I'm a theist because we know that these events, like these visionary experiences, might be exceedingly improbable. In other words, wouldn't it take essentially a miracle to have, let's say I say, all right, every belief in the resurrected Jesus was a visionary or hallucinatory experience, right? Let's say I even say that there was a group hallucination, that a bunch of people hallucinated together. Well, we know that group hallucinations are essentially impossible and are certainly so infinitesimally improbable that, that essentially we're back to kind of square one, where we say, well, the only way that this kind of set of experiences could have happened, we now have a naturalistic explanation, but it's so infinitesimally improbable that seems a lot like the intervention of a god on our universe, and that still creates an apparent resurrection. It still results in the same theological set of conclusions. Now, a lot of Christians will say, that's not a great argument to pose, but I think it's a reasonable thought experiment, at least. Now, I don't have a really great otherwise mechanistic explanation for the resurrection. So you do raise a good point there. I'll have to think about that some more. That's something I've been thinking about. And that's one of the reasons why why I still allow room for uncertainty, for intellectual growth in some of the things that I've expressed. So if there's plenty of people that you can listen to online who will say, I believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. I believe it was a physical resurrection, and I believe in that because Jesus has moved in my own life. I don't necessarily have that set of experiences. Maybe I will have that set of experiences someday, but I still think I can advocate for the messaging of Jesus in other ways. Now, if it's okay with you, I'd like to sort of kind of shift the focus using that as a point to dovetail into some of what my beliefs are about Jesus.
Sure, but before we do that, I do have one point to make before we move away from Apologia's minimal witness hypothesis, right? And this point, I think it's something, I'm not sure if you missed it or you know it, but you failed to mention it. But I think that the minimal witness hypothesis is not put forward as the most probable naturalistic cause of the belief in resurrection. I think it's just put forward as one possible or plausible way how it could have happened. And if we think about all the different possibilities of how the belief of resurrection could have arisen from naturalistic means, whether there was empty tomb or whether there wasn't, whether Peter saw a hallucination out of grief or because he suffered from epilepsy, or whether there was indeed a few women and Peter and a few other disciples saw the resurrection, or just one seeing a vision and then other people believe that person did. There's hundreds of possible naturalistic explanations. When you combine that together, how do we determine that is still less probable than a miracle did happen? So that's something that I want to bring to the table and to think about. Maybe you have some good response to that.
Yeah, my response to that is that there are certainly, and I say this explicitly in my video, if we define miracles as events that have a 0%, precisely 0% chance of happening, and we define the resurrection as, by definition, also being miraculous, and therefore, by definition, having a 0% chance of happening, then we could foist out whatever very improbable theories that wouldn't be very intellectually nourishing to talk about. We say, well, maybe Jesus was a time traveler. Maybe he was a multidimensional being, right? These are ways that we can preserve the laws of nature without necessarily invoking something that is explicitly in violation of those laws. Or we could say something totally ridiculous, like maybe there was a hidden secret twin, right? Like in the movie The Prestige, and Jesus just switched places with that twin, and they stole the body, and then the twin came forward and said, I'm the resurrected Jesus, and then everyone said, well, you look just like Jesus, so they all thought it was a resurrection. So, I mean, there's any kinds of, there's any number of theories that are infinitesimally probable. I think my point of making a critique of minimal witnesses was to say there are ways that this could strengthen the argument. Now, I wrote a long email to Paul, Paul is in Paulogia, and I said, here are ways that I think would strengthen the minimal witnesses argument. So I don't think we should throw it out entirely. I think we can strengthen it. I think that would be the most nourishing thing for all of us. I think we should all try to make each other's arguments stronger rather than trying to just say everything needs to be thrown out completely.
Okay, so you were going to bring this conversation to something else?
Yeah, so I'd like to this is kind of my own version of an opening statement, but I want to talk about what I am more certain of. And this is something that I hope you'll give me some pushback on. And this is the set of conclusions that to me points in the direction of Christianity being a reasonable outcome from a theistic perspective. So if you believe in God, and you're trying to pick from one of the existing religions, I think it becomes very persuasive that Christianity is the best choice in that setting. Now, I realize this may be somewhat contrived, but it was at least applicable to me, and I think it's something that you'll probably give some pushback on. But, I can talk about, there are several reasons why I think this. First of all, we do have Jesus as being uniquely venerated among religious figures in other religious traditions. Now, this is something that's very uncommon. Hinduism, Swami Vivekananda, who brought yoga to the United States, a tremendously influential Hindu scholar and thinker, believed that Jesus was an avatar, was a reincarnation of Krishna. We have very high up figures in Buddhism. We have the Dalai Lama, who felt that Jesus was a bodhisattva. We have Thich Nhat Hanh, who called Jesus his own intellectual and philosophical predecessor. Islam, of course, considers Jesus to be a prophet. We have Baha'u'llah, who founded the Baha'i faith, which is a really inspirational religion. He called Jesus the Son of Man. We have Messianic Judaism that has millions of followers. Even Zoroastrianism, a lot of Zoroastrian adherents have moved toward the conclusion that Jesus had at least some degree of divine authority. So to me, we have a bunch of religions that are pointing towards Jesus, and then we have Jesus who only points towards himself. So I think if you're picking from a theology, from an existing religious tradition, it's almost certain to me from that argument alone that you would pick Jesus. All right, here's belief number 2. We do have Jesus being a unique intellectual luminary with teachings that are still impactful and interesting from a multidisciplinary perspective. And we can prove that both quantitatively and qualitatively. Jesus is the only figure who's been directly cited by major thinkers in several different disciplines: philosophy, theology, ethics, sociology, psychology, literature. In every one of these fields, one of the main thinkers in that field in the last 100 years has cited Jesus directly. This is very uncommon for any thinker from antiquity or any ancient period, but it's exceedingly interesting to me that this comes from a theological source. And then I actually go through in one of my videos and I talk about all the.
You want me to respond at some points too, because you are making more than one point now, right?
Sure. We can stop here. These are kind of 5 points, and I could go through the other points really quickly if you want to respond to these arguments as a whole.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, my next point: the modern era has brought capitulation and conciliatory perspective in most theological systems. So most theologies have moved towards relegating their own miracle accounts to something that's really sort of optional or fictional or largely mythological. Christianity seems uniquely anti-fragile as an outlier for this trend. We have the death of Jesus being a theologically impactful inflection point for Jewish life, meaning after the death of Jesus, we see a lot of very significant theological changes in the lives of the Jews. And then the last point is we have much more quantitative and much different qualitative evidence and attestations in early Christianity compared to any other religious tradition. I'll stop there.
Okay.
Thanks for letting me go through that opening statement.
Yeah, sure. So to your first point that many religions or religious leaders point to Jesus, but Jesus only points to himself, I would say that's oversimplification, because when Christianity is the most popular religion in the world, you would expect any religious leader to interact with ideas in Christianity. And the main character in Christianity is Jesus. So at some point, if they want to do interfaith conversations, they would have to talk about who they think Jesus was. And you would notice that the way they talk about Jesus is not framing him in the Christian way, but in their own worldview, like saying that he's an avatar, he's a bodhisattva. That's not really veneration, that's domestication, that's appropriation, appropriating Jesus into their own religious worldview and let Jesus become part of their worldview. I think that's part of what Baha'i is doing. They are so diverse and so widely encompassing that they include the major religions in the world. I would say that it's something closer to syncretism. And we see this a lot in the East. I have a background I grew up in Taiwan, where Buddhism, Taoism, and folk religion are all intermingled together. Sometimes it's hard to tell which tradition, which deity, or which bodhisattva is which religion. So I'm not that impressed when other religious traditions point to Jesus. If anything, it just points to other religions having a more tolerant or broader worldview that can include Jesus into their religious system. But in Christianity, it's more monotheistic. So it's more exclusive instead of inclusive. So that's how I would explain it. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of responses. So it is important to note that we don't see this syncretic trend throughout all religions. In other words, we don't see Muhammad being elevated and venerated in the same way that Jesus.
Fiery debate over December 25th Christmas origins. A better way to put it is calculation theory versus histories of religion hypothesis, if you will. Both of these are combating here. Now, there's a scholar, Dr. T.C. Schmidt. I love the guy. I think he's a wonderful human being. He's an open Christian, right? He's a Christian, which, it's like you really do have to be cautious when someone just so happens to have a worldview that just so happens to line up with what facts oftentimes they want. But with him, when you get to hear him and listen to him, he's actually a very kind guy, very smart man. But he's going up against Neil from Gnostic Informant. Neil from Gnostic Informant has been challenging the calculation theory, which ultimately says that Christians have been trying to calculate the birth of Christ, and that's how they came to the conclusion of December 25th. Not that Sol Invictus and the larger Greco-Roman Mediterranean world and its celebrations on these special, spring equinoxes and winter solstices, the solstices and the equinoxes and stuff. It just so happens to be something that Christianity mimicked from the pagan world. That's something that we tend to lean toward versus the calculation model making sense of the whole thing. So we're going to actually get in. Here's why this is important. Before we continue, this is on Gnostic Informant's YouTube channel. When you want to know debates on YouTube that go on, now unless you're going to read the peer-reviewed literature and listen to the lectures from maybe some academic source, it's probably going to be a lot more dry. When it comes to the most cutting-edge debate discussion on this issue online, that's going to bring up primary sources and stuff on YouTube that I see, that's the tension going on, you're either going to go to Religion for Breakfast to see at least the discussion, or Gnostic Informant right now. Myth Vision does it too. We do it too on our big channel. But Neil's really big about this Christmas thing. And every Christmas, Christian apologist and others, even atheist Tim O'Neill, will come out of the woods swinging, punching, boom, knocking everyone down about the non-pagan origins of Christmas. That Christianity did not get this idea of celebrating the birth of Christ on the winter solstice from the pagan world. And at best, you might get someone who's a little more honest and saying, we're not so sure. But oftentimes they take a strong stance. It's like they need to axe grind against this idea. And I'm more open to the fact that Christians are clearly lifting pagan elements. So I wanted to start at 36 minutes and 30 seconds. We're going to get there. Let's start at the beginning here. I think it's important that we actually just get to the beginning, see what happens as he introduces T.C. Schmidt, and have some fun reacting to this content. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like, comment, I really, really hope that more and more people will be part of what we're doing here and share it to your communities. Really hope so. In the meantime, let's get the party started for Christmas. Here we go.
It is that time of the year, Christmas time, the holidays. December 17th, the traditional date where Saturnalia would start in ancient Rome. Today's topic has to do with the dating of Christmas, December 25th. Where does this date come from? Is it possible that it has some pre-Christian pagan influence? Or was there just a completely separate calculation being done by Christian church fathers in the early 3rd century? Christian scholar T.C. Schmidt received his PhD from Yale University and is an associate professor at Fairfield University. His publications concern topics such as the historical Jesus, the formation of the New Testament, the history of Christianity in Eastern context, and the origin of Christmas. Professor Schmidt has produced peer-reviewed translations from Latin, Greek, Syriac, and Arabic texts. His books have been published with Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and others.
He's a legit scholar, even though he's openly Christian, which doesn't stop people from being legit scholars. Delcy Allison Jr. We've got some bona fide gangster scholars. He is a little more on the conservative side, Christian-wise, clearly. But the dude knows the languages. He knows how to dive into this stuff, and so he is to be respected in considering what he says. Even if you go, well, I think there might be some bias there. We all have bias. Keep that in mind. But let's see how this one pans out.
He's written books on Josephus. And the topic today, he has written peer-reviewed articles on the calculation of December 25th.
So I didn't know he wrote a peer-reviewed article on this whole calculation hypothesis, but it makes sense. So this guy has put some blood, sweat, and tears into the staking of the fact that Christians calculated this independent, meaning the histories of religion position. No, the James George Fraser, the clearly the Christians are clearly picking up from a celebration that the already existing world was doing for a long time. Nah, they did their own calculation. They're completely kosher from that world.
Links are in the description. Please check those out. But today, we are having a fiery discussion on the origins of December 25th and also January 6th, the Epiphany.
Oh my God, me and Neil have gone down the rabbit hole on this one. I'm telling you, most of the scholars, like we were reading stuff in German. I'm having to translate stuff from like 1800s and early 1900s of scholars in Germany who've been tackling this for quite some time and showing the celebrations of Dionysus landing on the same day as Jesus's later Christian dates. What's going on here?
Borrowed or stolen from the pagans? Or was this all purely Christian and has nothing to do with any outside influence? We're going to get into that and more. You are about to attain true gnosis.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And joining me today for the second time, actually, is Dr. Thomas Schmidt, PhD from Yale University. As you just saw in the intro there, all his credentials, the paper that we're going to discuss. And it is the Christmas season, so I wanted to get you on. I actually reached out to you months ago about this, and when we talked about your new book, the Josephus book, which is links in the description for that, by the way. Great book. It's I heard some good things at the SBL conference. It's changing some minds. So that links in the.
I will say this. Steve Mason is very questionable he's questioning a lot of the conclusions that are drawn by Schmidt's work, and I think Schmidt knows that. So they've been in conversation on email, and Steve Mason has some really constructive criticism towards some of the things I think Schmidt tries to conclude.
Description, but when we talked about that book, I said, hey, I'm a fan of your article about the calculation theory that you wrote, and there's a link for this in the description as well if you guys want to read this. Calculating December 25th as the birth of Jesus in Hippolytus's canon and Chronicon. Thomas Schmidt, who's here today. There's the abstract here, but I'll let you discuss basically what you bring to the table, because there's three big articles when it comes to this discussion. The first one is from Dr. Heimans, who was kind of the first to shake up the idea of the history religions theory that December 25th has this pagan origins going on. And, Sol Invictus was I think it was a 19th century scholar who came along and said, it's not just Saturnalia, it's Sol Invictus, December 25th, Aurelian. And this became the consensus for like 200 years. Hymans comes along and says, whoa, hey, hold on a second. The evidence might not be that great. So then he kind of shakes things up. And then you come along, I want to say like 10 years later after that, something like that, maybe 5-10 years later, and you put out this article and saying, actually, there might be some calculations happening early on before Aurelian in 274. And Hippolytus of Rome, actually, we have some good evidence to suggest that he thought that the birth of Christ was on December 25th, and that the word genesis in Greek doesn't mean birth, but means conception. And you go through it in the article, and actually it's very convincing. By the way, how you show how Matthew uses the same word in Matthew for genesis, for conception, not birth. And if you're a Christian, you're probably going to follow suit, most likely. Who knows? It doesn't have to be. But I liked your arguments, and I just want to give you a chance to explain exactly what we're talking about here.
Thanks, Neil. The big question is always, why do we celebrate the birth of Jesus on December 25th? Why do Christians do that? Almost all Christians everywhere have done that for hundreds and hundreds of years. How did that come about? And there are a couple different theories. The one theory you mentioned, the history of religions theory, is that, well, there was a Roman pagan festival that occurred on December 25th. Some people say Saturnalia. Some people will say like Brumalia or Sigillaria or Sol Invictus, the feast to the sun god. And that once Christianity was taking hold in Rome, this date, December 25th, was selected in order to like please pagan sentiments or as a response to paganism or syncretism or something like that was happening.
That's a pretty... Now, his facial expressions aren't too happy with that. You can tell he's not so into it, probably because he feels like the evidence is lacking. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're talking about the Roman imperial world that rules, and we're gonna act like, nah, that doesn't make any influence or any impact. Now we're gonna get into the details because they're gonna argue often that stuff came after Christianity. Neil's gonna give some pushback, and you're gonna see some primary source evidence for that.
One theory. The other theory is that, well, if you look at early Christian writings, you can see that these early Christians are very interested in biblical chronology. They're interested in when dates happen in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. They're very interested in the crucifixion of Jesus. When did that happen? And of course, they're interested in when Jesus was born. And so they're putting out different dates. And they're using various assumptions, many of which some people might find a little strange today, but some assumptions about how and when Jesus was born. And the calculation theory goes that actually some early Christians selected the date of December 25th before these pagan celebrations on December 25th emerged. And they selected it not because of pagan ideas, but because they thought Jesus was born on that day due to various biblical chronological calculations and all these other assumptions that they had about how God created the world. You know, I thought growing up, I just assumed the Roman hypothesis was the correct one. I just...
This is the one that Neil and I are sympathetic to. Now, here's the deal. Is it either or could it be a mixture of both things? Does it have to be either the calculation theory or this? Or can it not be a potential mixture of things happening where, hey, they're also seeing this cosmic thing like we're seeing. We're going to, everybody's using the same cosmic kind of ideas. And so they're trying to put their figure, their cultic leader, and have him, at the equinoxes or the solstices.
Thought, yeah, I mean, this is probably Saturnalia or something like that. And then I was translating this commentary on the book of Daniel, written by an ancient Christian named Hippolytus of Rome. And in it, he says Jesus was born on December 25th. And I was shocked by this because he's writing around the year 200, 220, maybe 230. Seems so early to me. And then I found out that
so early, December 25th, so early. And listen, 220, You know, for this debate, you'd be shocked that that's kind of early for a lot of these people who are in this debate. But you may not be in the know on a lot of this stuff, and that's fine. Neil has been looking at this a lot more, and he's clashed heads with some of these guys, Tim O'Neill and others who are total fans of the Christians. Actually, the first ones who did this, and if anything, pagans borrowed from them or came independently somehow.
Feast of the Sun God wasn't developed or didn't develop until the 270s. You know, very interesting stuff. However,
notice how you just said that 270s is when the feast to the sun god. So this would have been Sol Invictus or whatever other deity you want to pin to that date later. Hippolytus is 50 years before that.
You and I think some of your listeners will know that passage in the commentary is highly debated because it turns out not all the manuscripts say December 25th. One doesn't give any date. And then another one, the earliest one, gives this bizarre contradictory double date.
Yeah, April and December, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Neil's been looking into this stuff, ladies and gentlemen. I'm telling you, he knows this stuff. And a lot of the PhDs out there, they kind of, you know, don't get me wrong, they got 3 letters before their name. They've learned, they've earned, they've got a lot under their belt. But me and Neil been digging into this stuff for a minute, and I feel like, you know, a little respect is, you know, due, if you will, for some of the deep research we do and that we're looking into this stuff. And our common sense kicks in on a lot of this stuff, and it makes us think, And Schmidt might be walking into a landmine here. Love the guy, smart guy, don't get me wrong. But he might be walking into something here that might change his mind. And if it does, wow, it'd be amazing to see. If it ends up switching his mind about the article he wrote. I don't know, we'll see.
And so, you know, it looks like clearly someone has monkeyed about with the manuscripts. And
and there's also the
meaning some of the earliest manuscripts don't have the date December 25th, which means if Hippolytus didn't really write it, and most of them question that he wrote that, a later Christian scribe potentially added the date because by then everybody knows Jesus was born on December 25th. So you get a later scribe in this tradition preserving or, you know, translating this manuscript. He puts in December 25th, which would mean most scholars who don't think that this was there originally does not place the calculation at that time in the 220s, which would mean it had to be later, which could mean if the sun feast is in 270 and it's not in Hippolytus in the 220s, did Christians get it after that? After 270?
The idea that later Christians, once they have a liturgical date for December 25th, there's a tendency to kind of go back and sort of fix which is understandable. You know, you want everything to be uniform. You don't want to pass down, you know, to the students of the future, confuse them all with all these dates. Let's just fix them all, and so we're all on the same page. I get it.
Exactly. And we know that something like that was happening. I mean, it's unlikely that Hippolytus wrote 3 different things, and so we've got 3 different manuscript traditions. It seems like something is happening. It is possible he wrote 2 different things. There is some evidence that he changed his mind, but so that's where things stood, and I just kind of let that be for a little bit. And then I was translating a different work of Hippolytus, probably by the same author, written in 235 or 222. And I noticed something really interesting. This work seems to say that Jesus was born 9 months after the anniversary of the creation of the world. And if you look at it's a chronological work, it's called the Chronicon. And if you look at when Hippolytus thought the world was created, he was, we would call him today, if he was around today, he would be called a 6-day creationist. So he read the opening chapters of Genesis very literally. Not all early Christians did that, but he did do that. And he thought that the world was created about 5,000 years ago. And he thought, you know, if you're a 6-day creationist, there has to be a day. You have to select a calendar day in which God, on day 1 and then day 2 and day 3 and day 4. And so he's trying to figure this out. And it looks like he places the first day of creation on March 25th. And if he thought Jesus was born 9 months after that, if that's the anniversary of the creation of the world, March 25th, which was the vernal equinox in the Roman calendar, then
is that coincidence itself? I mean, is the creation of the world aligning on March 25th by this author coincidence? Just saying. like, would it be assumed that maybe because it is the vernal equinox that everyone kind of thought maybe that is the birth of life? All greenery and fertility is on this day, so this would be evidence in nature about the day in which God might have created the world. I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but you might think that everyone kind of might have been pointing in this direction, or at least a large portion of people who are looking at this would probably look to that and go, hey, you know what? That makes sense.
That's December 25th.
9 months exactly.
9 months
So
exactly.
I wrote an article on that, and is some other very interesting corroborating evidence, and one comes from this statue, which I actually have a picture of.
Yeah. Where
So
did they find this? They dug this up.
They dug it up. Yeah, it was found in the 1500s in Rome, and it was heavily damaged. The figure you see there is almost completely restored.
Isn't it modeled off of another Herodotean one or something like that? Or I think maybe.
Yeah, that rings a bell.
Yeah.
I think
it looks very familiar,
so.
but yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I could be wrong. Yeah,
that's awesome.
You can tell that the throne or the chair is actually a lot older than the seated figure, because when it was found, the figure was totally broken off, so they had to completely restore it. And there are several scholars, even a majority of scholars, believe that the statue was originally of a woman, not a man.
Yes.
Interesting.
I remember that. Yeah.
So that's a whole other.
If you take the head off and just pretend the head's not there, you can almost see why they would think that.
Yeah, there's only 1 or 2 drawings of the statue before it was redone, and in one of them it looks like a woman. It definitely looks female. So, well, what we're interested in is what's on the inscribed on the side of the chair. I've got another picture I can try and share too. Let me see if I can.
Oh yeah, that's a nice picture. Okay. Because I've been looking for good pictures of this, and I'm glad you found one of these, because these are pretty hard to find.
They are, because this is at the Vatican Library, and the Vatican is very particular about who they let take pictures.
Yeah.
I have seen this statue.
I doubt they'd let me take pictures.
Myself.
Wow.
And it's very striking. And I actually do have much better pictures, but I'm not allowed to share them, unfortunately. It's really sad.
That's crazy. Not allowed to.
I know. Let me give another.
So that's dates, though, right?
Yes. This is a calendar. We're looking at a calendar to track the date of Easter. And Easter is when Christians celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And Easter is correlated to Passover, because Jesus died 3 days after Passover. So in order to calculate Easter, you have to calculate Passover. And that is what this the other side of the statue does. The other side of the statue, this calculates the date of Passover. And there's 2 sets of inscriptions. The bigger one on the right is the Passover calendar. The one on the left, which is on sort of the rounded corner of the statue, that is a list of titles of Christian compositions. The reason why I'm showing this statue is that this Passover calendar, from these inscriptions, we know that the throne of the statue was inscribed in 222 AD. And that makes it arguably the earliest precisely datable Christian artifact in the world. There are Christian artifacts that are earlier, but we have to just give a rough estimate of when and where they came from, or at least when they were created. With this, though, we know that this was inscribed in 222 AD, and we know this for 2 reasons. One is the heading of the inscription says that it dates to year 1 of Emperor Alexander Severus, which is 222. The second reason is that the calendar begins in 222 AD, and then the third reason is that when you look at the calendar and you examine its accuracy, the calendar is trying to predict when the Passover moon. The Passover is a lunar holiday. So the Passover moon is the first full moon after the vernal equinox. And of course, the phases of the moon move around the calendar. So the date of Passover moves. The Paschal moon. The date of Passover moves by 3 or 4 weeks, potentially, year to year.
Right.
And
it can go up until April 25th, between March 25th and April 25th, or March 15th and April 25th. Isn't that what it is?
It all depends on when you think the vernal equinox is.
Right, but I'm
And
saying
that
those are like
was-
the maximum dates on each side.
Yes, but basically late April to late March to late
That's
April.
why sometimes we have 420 Easter, sometimes Easter's.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And
Interesting.
the fascinating thing about this is that the calendar, it actually turns out it's very hard to predict the phases of the moon. You need to have extremely good astronomical knowledge. And this calendar, from an astronomical perspective, is deeply flawed. And so it only correctly predicts the Passover moon 2 or 3 years before 222 and 2 or 3 years afterwards. And then it becomes completely off. So the reasoning goes, obviously the person who made this was probably doing their observations, their astronomical observations, a couple years before 222 AD. They came up with their method. They inscribed it on the stone. It was accurate for a few years, and then it quickly became inaccurate, and it was very embarrassing.
And they're trying to get to what, 30 CE AD? Was that what they're trying to do? 33? Like, how do they know when to find the moon in what year?
So that is a great question. Yes. So if it turns out, if you come up with the correct mathematical astronomical method to predict the Passover moon, you can also retrograde the Passover cycles. So you could then, in theory, figure out not just when the Passover will occur in the future, but figure out when specific Passovers occurred in the past. And if you know the exact date that Jesus had the Last Supper, his Passover meal before he was crucified, you can figure out the exact day of the week and the exact month of the day of the month that Jesus had that Last Supper.
Yeah.
So technically, ultimately, this is a calculation model that I imagine Schmidt sees as influential on why they would start putting Jesus's date of his birth on December 25th. So you have all these calculations, you even have archaeology showing people are calculating and trying to figure out what day, when, all these things. When did Jesus do this? What day? These kinds of things on a calendar. Therefore, one can suppose Christians also did this for the birth of Christ on December the 25th. Now, even if that is the case, that there's a calculation involved, you got to ask yourself, why is it that it just so happens to land on the same day that the Roman world or those in the Greek world were already in Plutarch and such in the Roman world, we're already landing on this day? We're going to get there.
And that's what Hippolytus tries to do in this calendar. He tries to go backwards in time.
And it's my understanding that if we actually go with what we know now, I'm not talking about what Hippolytus knew or what he guessed, but for what we know now, from the 30s, 28 to 33 or 28 to 36 CE, I don't think there is a single year in that time period when the Passover actually does fall on March 25th. Is there?
You're correct. Well, remember, it has to not just be March 25th. It also has to, March 25th also would have to be a Thursday or a Friday.
Right. And if I'm not mistaken, we don't have.
Correct.
It just doesn't line up.
Yes, I believe you're right. That it just doesn't work. In fact, now with all we know of astronomy, there's only really two possible dates. One is 30 AD April 7th, and the other is 33 AD April 3rd.
So you can't even get March 25th at all. Okay, like historically, there cannot be an authentic, which who cares? Because the New Testament doesn't say the exact, March 25th is when this thing happened. No, they're tracking time based on lunar calendar, Jewish festivals, etc., which I would even say and argue these same times of the year also correlate to the other festivals that we find within Attis and other, ancient festivals. You might even go back to ancient Babylonia to find some interesting Jewish overlaps and stuff. Anyway, I want to hear what Neil has to say, but it's like, you can't even put it at that time. So then, historically, it can't land on March 25th. You've got people doing calculations that are weirdly off, and they are doing them much later. Why are they wanting to calculate? Why are they calculating these things at all? Are they inspired from the Greek and Roman world? Were the Greeks and Romans calculating anything, or potentially trying to pin stuff on these special days? This is part one of the reaction to this debate that's going on. Very gentle start off. Neil is taking on Tishy Schmidt on this ideas. on this idea about the calculation versus the history of religion school. And Schmidt is going to see some sources that he has never seen before. You're going to have to stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel if you're looking for the original and you're not interested in listening to me blabber on about my reaction to this. The original should be in the description, and I hope that you will go check out and subscribe to Gnostic Informant. But until next time, like, share, comment, and subscribe. See you then.
Let me ask you a question. If you were inventing a superhero from scratch, would you give him a backstory that makes absolutely no sense? Would you fill his origin story with impossible timelines, wrong geography, and frankly ludicrous plot holes? Probably not, right? Why make life difficult for yourself? If you're lying, you usually try to keep it simple. And yet, this is the exact logic used by Christian apologists, and surprisingly, even by some of the most brilliant atheists, to argue that Jesus must have been a real historical figure. We need to talk about the criterion of embarrassment. Let's look at the Gospel of Luke. We all know the yarn, a worldwide census requiring Joseph to drag his heavily pregnant virgin bride all the way to his ancestral hometown of Bethlehem. Historically, it's a mess. We know this story is full of improbable errors. Even many Christians admit it's just a charming fable. But here is where the trap snaps shut. The late, great Christopher Hitchens, no friend of religion, looked at this mess in his book, God is Not Great, and actually used it to defend the existence of Jesus. He tried to be fair-minded, and he argued this: why go to a huge amount of fabrication concerning Augustus, Herod, Quirinius, and a census to move the scene to Bethlehem? A much easier fabrication would have had him born in Bethlehem in the first place. Do you see the logic? Hitchens is saying this is inverse proof. The argument is that the author, Luke, was stuck with a stubborn historical fact. A real guy named Jesus was born in Nazareth. So Luke had to invent this convoluted, embarrassing census nonsense just to move the action to Bethlehem to fulfill prophecy. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? doesn't it? If the story was pure fiction, Luke would have just written Jesus was born in Bethlehem. The fact that he struggled suggests he was wrestling with reality. But today, I'm going to show you why that argument holds absolutely no water. The idea that this clumsy story proves a historical Jesus is based on a fatal assumption about how these texts were written. We're going to look at the evidence, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll see that Luke wasn't trying to hide a historical fact. He was trying to fix a literary plot hole. Let's get into it. So, does this argument hold water? Is the absurdity of the census proof that Jesus was real? In reality, this is just a variation of what scholars call the criterion of embarrassment. The idea is that if a text says something embarrassing or difficult for the author, it's likely true because, well, why would you lie to make yourself look bad? But in this specific case, the argument commits a fatal error. It collapses because it rests on a single massive assumption. The argument assumes that the author, who we call Luke, sat down to write a biography. It assumes he was acting like a historian, looking at a list of stubborn facts he had to use, and then weaving in some fiction to make those facts fit a prophecy. It assumes Luke was thinking, drat, I'm stuck with this real guy from Nazareth. How do I get him to Bethlehem? But he didn't. That is not how ancient literature works, and that is certainly not how the Gospels were written. Luke didn't have facts in front of him. He wasn't looking at a historical person. He was looking at other scrolls. He had earlier versions of the Jesus tale sitting right on his desk. We know for a fact that Luke had access to at least 2 earlier drafts of the myth, the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. This is crucial. Luke wasn't reconciling history. He was reconciling literature. He was editing previous fan fiction. And when you realize that Luke is just the third writer in a game of telephone, the need for a real Jesus evaporates. He isn't covering up a historical birth in Nazareth. He's trying to fix the continuity errors left by the writers who came before him. So, to understand why the census exists, we don't need to look for a real man. We need to look at the scrolls Luke was reading. And the first one he picked up was Mark. To understand the mess Luke found himself in, we have to look at the script he was editing. We have to go back to the very first gospel written, the Gospel of Mark. Now, if you've never actually read Mark in isolation, you might be surprised by what's missing. Mark has absolutely nothing to say about the birth of Jesus. There was no manger, no star, no shepherds, and definitely no Bethlehem. In Mark's version of the story, Jesus just shows up as an adult. But wait, I hear you asking, doesn't Mark call him Jesus of Nazareth? Well, this is where things get sticky. If we look at the original Greek manuscripts, and we always need to check the Greek, the writer almost never says Jesus is from a place called Nazareth. From the first miracle at Capernaum all the way to the angel speaking at the empty tomb, Mark refers to him as Jesus the Nazarene, or Nazarene. Now, your Sunday school teacher told you Nazarene means guy from Nazareth, like saying New Yorker means guy from New York. But linguistically, that is extremely shaky. Scholars argue that this word actually comes from the Hebrew word netzer, which means branch. The Nazarene wasn't a geographic label, it was a title. It meant the branch or the offshoot, an appropriate label for a hero bringing a new message from God, a new sect breaking away from mainstream Judaism. Think of it this way. If I call someone a Baptist, does that mean they are from a town called Baptist? No, it describes their theology, not their zip code. Mark wasn't telling us where Jesus lived, he was telling us what Jesus was. Now, you might spot the word Nazareth in the opening baptism scene in your modern Bible. But if we look closely at the textual evidence, that intrusion of the specific town name is likely what we call a later harmonizing interpolation, a fancy way of saying a scribe added it later to make the story fit with the other Gospels. So in the original layer of the myth, we don't have a man from a town. A fancy way of saying a scribe added it later to make the story fit with the other Gospels. But if we look closely at the textual evidence, that intrusion of the specific town name is likely what we call a later harmonizing interpolation, a fancy way of saying a scribe added it later to make the story fit with the other Gospels. So in the original layer of the myth, we don't have a man from a town. We have a divine hero with a title, the branch. But then along came Matthew, and Matthew didn't understand the title. He thought it was a location. So we have Mark, who calls Jesus the branch. Then, late in the day, after the original end of the world deadline had passed, the author of Matthew comes along to expand the story. Matthew looks at Mark's text, sees the word Nazarene, and makes a critical mistake. He misinterprets the title for a location. He thinks Mark is saying Jesus is from the town of Nazareth. But Matthew also knows his Jewish scripture. He knows the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. So now he's stuck. He has to reconcile Nazareth from Mark with Bethlehem from prophecy. So does he have a census? Does he have a donkey ride? No. Matthew takes the easy way out. In his version, the Holy Family doesn't travel to Bethlehem for a birth, they live there. Read Matthew carefully. There is no stable. There is no room at the inn. In Matthew's gospel, Joseph and Mary live in a house in Bethlehem. That is their home. So how does Jesus end up in Nazareth? Matthew has to invent a reason to move them. He writes a dramatic story where they flee to Egypt to escape a massacre. And when they come back years later, they don't go back to their home in Judea. They move north to the Galilean city of Nazareth. And here is the kicker. Why does Matthew say they moved to Nazareth? He explicitly writes that they moved there to fulfill a prophecy. He shall be called a Nazarene. Here is the problem. That prophecy does not exist. You can search the entire Old Testament from front to back. You will not find a single verse that says the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. Matthew either botched the translation or he simply made it up to force the geography to work. So we have a Jesus born in a house in Bethlehem who only moves to Nazareth later to fulfill a fake prophecy. It's a complete mess. But then comes Luke. He reads Matthew's draft, sees this fake prophecy, and realizes, I can't use this. This is weak. And that is where the fabrication gets truly creative. And finally, we arrive at the author responsible for the Christmas pageant version we all know, Luke. Think of Luke as the cleanup guy. He sits down to write his version, and he has Matthew's text in front of him. He reads Matthew's explanation that the family moved to Nazareth to fulfill the prophecy, he shall be called a Nazarene. Luke checks his sources and realizes that prophecy does not exist. He knows Matthew's claim is weak. It has absolutely no scriptural support. So Luke makes an editorial decision. He deletes the prophecy. He drops any reference to it. But he's stuck with the tradition Matthew popularized, that the boy Jesus grew up in the obscure Galilean city of Nazareth. That part of the myth had stuck. So Luke has a new problem. He has a humble family living in Nazareth, but the theology demands the baby be born in Bethlehem. He needs a plot device. He needs a mechanism to get them out of the house and onto the road. He can't use Matthew's "we lived there all along" excuse because he's already rejected Matthew's reasoning. So Luke goes digging in the history books. He looks at the works of the Jewish historian Josephus and finds a real historical event, the census of Quirinius. Luke realizes this is the perfect narrative bridge. A census requires travel. It explains why a carpenter would drag a pregnant woman across the country. It worked much more convincingly than Matthew's vague, made-up prophecy. So Luke writes it in. He ignores the fact that the dates don't line up. He ignores the fact that Roman censuses didn't work that way. He just needs the characters to move. And while he was at it, Luke tidied up the rest of the mess. He dropped Matthew's unconvincing story about a massacre of infants. He cut the flight to Egypt. Instead, he substituted an orderly, peaceful blessing in Jerusalem from an elderly prophet and then had the family return home to Nazareth. It's all very sweet. It's all very familiar. And it is all very, very bogus. The census isn't a memory of a historical event. It is a literary patch, a rewrite designed to fix a plot hole created by a mistranslation in the text that came before it. So let's circle back to where we started. Was the late Christopher Hitchens right? Does the awkwardness of the story, the absurdity of the census, prove that a real Jesus existed? Absolutely not. When you lay the documents side by side, the criterion of embarrassment completely falls apart. We aren't looking at a historian trying to cover up a stubborn fact. We are watching a myth evolve in real time. Just look at the progression. First, you have Mark, who gives us a theological title, the Nazarene or the branch. Then you have Matthew, who misunderstands the title as a location and invents a fake prophecy to force the geography to work. And finally, you have Luke, who realizes Matthew's nonsense, deletes it, and pastes in a census from Josephus to bridge the gap. The census isn't proof of a historical man born in Nazareth. It is proof of a literary cleanup job. It's a contortion necessary to fix a plot hole left by the previous writers. The story is sweet, it's familiar, we sing songs about it every December. But as we can clearly see now, it is all very bogus. If you want exclusive content, early access to videos, and want to support this rational quest, consider joining our YouTube membership community. You become part of the family, helping us navigate this rich tapestry of ancient narratives. Until next time, keep delving, keep questioning, and stay curious.
Today's episode is titled The Shame.
Let me ask you a question. If you were inventing a superhero from scratch, would you give him a backstory that makes absolutely no sense? Would you fill his origin story with impossible timelines, wrong geography, and frankly ludicrous plot holes? Probably not, right? Why make life difficult for yourself? If you're lying, you usually try to keep it simple. And yet, this is the exact logic used by Christian apologists, and surprisingly, even by some of the most brilliant atheists, to argue that Jesus must have been a real historical figure. We need to talk about the criterion of embarrassment. Let's look at the Gospel of Luke. We all know the yarn, a worldwide census requiring Joseph to drag his heavily pregnant virgin bride all the way to his ancestral hometown of Bethlehem. Historically, it's a mess. We know this story is full of improbable errors. Even many Christians admit it's just a charming fable. But here is where the trap snaps shut. The late, great Christopher Hitchens, no friend of religion, looked at this mess in his book, God is Not Great, and actually used it to defend the existence of Jesus. He tried to be fair-minded, and he argued this: why go to a huge amount of fabrication concerning Augustus, Herod, Quirinius, and a census to move the scene to Bethlehem? A much easier fabrication would have had him born in Bethlehem in the first place. Do you see the logic? Hitchens is saying this is inverse proof. The argument is that the author, Luke, was stuck with a stubborn historical fact. A real guy named Jesus was born in Nazareth. So Luke had to invent this convoluted, embarrassing census nonsense just to move the action to Bethlehem to fulfill prophecy. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? If the story was pure fiction, Luke would have just written Jesus was born in Bethlehem. The fact that he struggled suggests he was wrestling with reality. But today, I'm going to show you why that argument holds absolutely no water. The idea that this clumsy story proves a historical Jesus is based on a fatal assumption about how these texts were written. We're going to look at the evidence, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll see that Luke wasn't trying to hide a historical fact. He was trying to fix a literary plot hole. Let's get into it. So, does this argument hold water? Is the absurdity of the census proof that Jesus was real? In reality, this is just a variation of what scholars call the criterion of embarrassment. The idea is that if a text says something embarrassing or difficult for the author, it's likely true because, well, why would you lie to make yourself look bad? But in this specific case, the argument commits a fatal error. It collapses because it rests on a single massive assumption. The argument assumes that the author, who we call Luke, sat down to write a biography. It assumes he was acting like a historian, looking at a list of stubborn facts he had to use, and then weaving in some fiction to make those facts fit a prophecy. It assumes Luke was thinking, drat, I'm stuck with this real guy from Nazareth. How do I get him to Bethlehem? But he didn't. That is not how ancient literature works, and that is certainly not how the Gospels were written. Luke didn't have facts in front of him. He wasn't looking at a historical person. He was looking at other scrolls. He had earlier versions of the Jesus tale sitting right on his desk. We know for a fact that Luke had access to at least 2 earlier drafts of the myth, the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. This is crucial. Luke wasn't reconciling history. He was reconciling literature. He was editing previous fan fiction. And when you realize that Luke is just the 3rd writer in a game of telephone, the need for a real Jesus evaporates. He isn't covering up a historical birth in Nazareth. He's trying to fix the continuity errors left by the writers who came before him. So, to understand why the census exists, we don't need to look for a real man. We need to look at the scrolls Luke was reading. And the first one he picked up was Mark. To understand the mess Luke found himself in, we have to look at the script he was editing. We have to go back to the very first gospel written, the Gospel of Mark. Now, if you've never actually read Mark in isolation, you might be surprised by what's missing. Mark has absolutely nothing to say about the birth of Jesus. There was no manger, no star, no shepherds, and definitely no Bethlehem. In Mark's version of the story, Jesus just shows up as an adult. But wait, I hear you asking, doesn't Mark call him Jesus of Nazareth? Well, this is where things get sticky. If we look at the original Greek manuscripts, and we always need to check the Greek, the writer almost never says Jesus is from a place called Nazareth. From the first miracle at Capernaum all the way to the angel speaking at the empty tomb, Mark refers to him as Jesus the Nazarene, or Nazarene. Now, your Sunday school teacher told you Nazarene means guy from Nazareth, like saying New Yorker means guy from New York. But linguistically, that is extremely shaky. Scholars argue that this word actually comes from the Hebrew word netzer, which means branch. The Nazarene wasn't a geographic label, it was a title. It meant the branch or the offshoot, an appropriate label for a hero bringing a new message from God, a new sect breaking away from mainstream Judaism. Think of it this way. If I call someone a Baptist, does that mean they are from a town called Baptist? No. It describes their theology, not their zip code. Mark wasn't telling us where Jesus lived, he was telling us what Jesus was. Now, you might spot the word Nazareth in the opening baptism scene in your modern Bible. But if we look closely at the textual evidence, that intrusion of the specific town name is likely what we call a later harmonizing interpolation, a fancy way of saying a scribe added it later to make the story fit with the other gospels. So in the original layer of the myth, we don't have a man from a town. We have a divine hero with a title, the branch. But then along came Matthew, and Matthew didn't understand the title. He thought it was a location. So we have Mark, who calls Jesus the branch. Then, late in the day, after the original end of the world deadline had passed, the author of Matthew comes along to expand the story. Matthew looks at Mark's text, sees the word Nazarene, and makes a critical mistake. He misinterprets the title for a location. He thinks Mark is saying Jesus is from the town of Nazareth. But Matthew also knows his Jewish scripture. He knows the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. So now he's stuck. He has to reconcile Nazareth from Mark with Bethlehem from prophecy. So does he have a census? Does he have a donkey ride? No. Matthew takes the easy way out. In his version, the Holy Family doesn't travel to Bethlehem for a birth, they live there. Read Matthew carefully. There is no stable. There is no room at the inn. In Matthew's gospel, Joseph and Mary live in a house in Bethlehem. That is their home. So how does Jesus end up in Nazareth? Matthew has to invent a reason to move them. He writes a dramatic story where they flee to Egypt to escape a massacre. And when they come back years later, they don't go back to their home in Judea. They move north to the Galilean city of Nazareth. And here is the kicker. Why does Matthew say they moved to Nazareth? He explicitly writes that they moved there to fulfill a prophecy. He shall be called a Nazarene. Here is the problem. That prophecy does not exist. You can search the entire Old Testament from front to back. You will not find a single verse that says the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. Matthew either botched the translation or he simply made it up to force the geography to work. So we have a Jesus born in a house in Bethlehem who only moves to Nazareth later to fulfill a fake prophecy. It's a complete mess. But then comes Luke. He reads Matthew's draft, sees this fake prophecy, and realizes, I can't use this. This is weak. And that is where the fabrication gets truly creative. And finally, we arrive at the author responsible for the Christmas pageant version we all know, Luke. Think of Luke as the cleanup guy. He sits down to write his version, and he has Matthew's text in front of him. He reads Matthew's explanation that the family moved to Nazareth to fulfill the prophecy, he shall be called a Nazarene. Luke checks his sources and realizes that prophecy does not exist. He knows Matthew's claim is weak. It has absolutely no scriptural support. So Luke makes an editorial decision. He deletes the prophecy. He drops any reference to it. But he's stuck with the tradition Matthew popularized, that the boy Jesus grew up in the obscure Galilean city of Nazareth. That part of the myth had stuck. So Luke has a new problem. He has a humble family living in Nazareth, but the theology demands the baby be born in Bethlehem. He needs a plot device. He needs a mechanism to get them out of the house and onto the road. He can't use Matthew's "we lived there all along" excuse because he's already rejected Matthew's reasoning. So Luke goes digging in the history books. He looks at the works of the Jewish historian Josephus and finds a real historical event, the census of Quirinius. Luke realizes this is the perfect narrative bridge. A census requires travel. It explains why a carpenter would drag a pregnant woman across the country. It worked much more convincingly than Matthew's vague, made-up prophecy. So Luke writes it in. He ignores the fact that the dates don't line up. He ignores the fact that Roman censuses didn't work that way. He just needs the characters to move. And while he was at it, Luke tidied up the rest of the mess. He dropped Matthew's unconvincing story about a massacre of infants. He cut the flight to Egypt. Instead, he substituted an orderly, peaceful blessing in Jerusalem from an elderly prophet and then had the family return home to Nazareth. It's all very sweet. It's all very familiar. And it is all very, very bogus. The census isn't a memory of a historical event. It is a literary patch, a rewrite designed to fix a plot hole created by a mistranslation in the text that came before it. So let's circle back to where we started. Was the late Christopher Hitchens right? Does the awkwardness of the story, the absurdity of the census, prove that a real Jesus existed? Absolutely not. When you lay the documents side by side, the criterion of embarrassment completely falls apart. We aren't looking at a historian trying to cover up a stubborn fact. We are watching a myth evolve in real time. Just look at the progression. First, you have Mark, who gives us a theological title, the Nazarene or the branch. Then you have Matthew, who misunderstands the title as a location and invents a fake prophecy to force the geography to work. And finally, you have Luke, who realizes Matthew's nonsense, deletes it, and pastes in a census from Josephus to bridge the gap. The census isn't proof of a historical man born in Nazareth. It is proof of a literary cleanup job. It's a contortion necessary to fix a plot hole left by the previous writers. The story is sweet, it's familiar, we sing songs about it every December. But as we can clearly see now, it is all very bogus. If you want exclusive content, early access to videos, and want to support this rational quest, consider joining our YouTube membership community. You become part of the family, helping us navigate this rich tapestry of ancient narratives. Until next time, keep delving, keep questioning, and stay curious.